How is everyone doing? Strength Chat episode 93, and today I have got a very special guest for you. Today I'm joined by the founder of Stronger by Science and a competitive powerlifter. Today I am joined by Greg Nuckols. How are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. What have you been up to? What's been happening in your world recently?
Uh, Nothing much really. Um, Graduated from grad school in May and just trying to get reacclimated to life on the outside ever since, I guess.
So how does it feel to have graduated and finished then?
Good. It's good to not have to go to school every day anymore. And at this point I'm quite confident I'm never going back. So, from the time I was 5 years old until this past May, I was either in school or knew that at some point I was going back to school.
Yeah.
Uh, and now that is not hanging over me anymore. So that's a good feeling.
Good. Yeah, I must admit, sometimes I know from myself graduating from uni, yes, I still like learning, still like, reading and that sort of stuff. But yeah, it must be a nice load off your shoulders to know that, you might not have to go back, which is good.
Yes,
So
sir.
for everyone listening who might not know your background or have seen what Stronger by Science do, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Um, sure. So my name's Greg. I have competed in powerlifting for the last, I don't know, 14, 15 years, give or take. I coach people to compete in powerlifting and yeah, write about powerlifting, science, stuff like that. So that's me and what I do.
So in terms of obviously they're sort of like writing about powerlifting and the science and that sort of stuff, did you always want to get involved in sort of the academic and the research side of things, or did you just end up gravitating towards that naturally?
Just kind of gravitated towards that over time. I'm not much of a planner. um, so yeah, I just kind of just follow my passions, I guess, and kind of figure out what I'm good at over time. So it's not like, 10 years ago or something, I set out to be doing what I'm doing now. Just kind of one thing led to another and wound up here.
uh, so touching on powerlifting, because I'm quite glad you said that you don't plan a lot of things out, because yeah, I think I'm sort of similar in that I don't try and think too far ahead. I'll try and just see what's coming along. But for myself, stopping playing rugby, sort of gravitated towards powerlifting, and then became a little bit more geeky, if you like, into the ins and outs of powerlifting. I think it's one of them sports where you can geek out a little bit on it. How did you sort of get involved in powerlifting and start writing about powerlifting? What was your sort of introduction into it?
I got involved in powerlifting because I got too injured to play real sports anymore. Um, so I, before touching a barbell for the first time, I had a reasonably extensive injury history from sports, mostly American football and basketball. And kind of the final blow was in football camp between grades 10 and 11, I believe. 9 and 10 or 10 and 11, one of the two. I had a really, really bad concussion. Like the type where I had to get a brain scan, and
Oh
the
wow!
doctor said, like, if I had another one that was similarly bad, I'd probably either end up dead or like in a vegetative state.
Wow!
Um, so there was enough brain trauma going on that they said I couldn't participate in any sport with a contact element for at least the next 6 months.
Okay.
So that ruled out the next season for both American football and basketball. Um, and so I had been working with a coach up to that point, mostly for basketball, to try to work on my vertical. And so I was fortunate that it happened to be Travis Mash, who at the time was one of the best multiply powerlifters on the planet.
Yeah.
And he was like, it seems like it sucks now, but you're better at lifting weights than you are other sports in the first place.
Yeah.
So I got into powerlifting just as a way to, just keep the competitive juices flowing. And it's a sport that ideally you shouldn't experience any head trauma when doing. And if you do, you did something really wrong.
Yeah, that's one of the main adverts that if you bang your head in or do something like that, then a bench press has gone drastically wrong on that.
Correct. And then in terms of how I got into writing, so my now wife, at the time girlfriend, in college was my training partner, still is my training partner. But back then I was like, I'm still pretty obsessed with this stuff, but I was maybe even more so, just obsessed with training and like geeking out about this stuff. And so I would just talk about it all the time. And I just got on her nerves, and she was like, hey, instead of like talking my ear off about this one subject and only this one subject constantly, why don't maybe you start a blog and try to find some other weirdos like you who want to talk about this stuff all the time? So that's how I got into writing, just by annoying my girlfriend.
Some positives out of that,
Yeah.
which is good. And obviously, we chatted a little bit before we started sort of recording the podcast about the research side of things. I know for me, it's quite funny actually. When I was at university, I sort of struggled reading research, and it took me a little bit of time to digest it and process it. And then obviously now with Stronger by Science, with Mass, obviously comes out every month. It's a little bit more. I probably read more journals now than probably what I did when I was at university. Which maybe that should have been the other way around. In terms of the research side of things, what was your interest in finding out about powerlifting and researching strength training, and then trying to conduct your own research as well?
So I guess first part there, reason I wanted to learn more about powerlifting and strength training is just because I thought it was cool. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I could answer that on a deeper level.
Yeah.
I just tried it. I thought it was awesome. And I was like, oh, okay. Like if I'm going to be doing this, I want to know as much about it as I can. Yeah. Before I had, any inkling that this is what I was going to do professionally, I'm the type of person where if I take up a hobby, I don't dabble. Like if I take up a hobby, I want to know everything about it.
Yeah.
So, at the time, 15, 16 years old, like if I did anything professionally, it was be a high school student. But then my passion was powerlifting. Like that was my main hobby. And so I wanted to learn everything I could possibly know about it. At this point, powerlifting, coaching, that's my job. And like now my main hobby is cooking. And so I'm like, I'm still trying to learn more about lifting because like that's my 9 to 5.
Yeah.
I put, 8 to 12 hours a day into that. But outside of that, now I'm just as weird and obsessive about learning more about the science of cooking as I was with learning more about the science of powerlifting back in the day.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's why I wanted to know more about it. Like I don't like doing anything and not obsessing about it. That's just my personality. And then what drew me toward the science side of things, I guess, is like, so I think that one of the things that frustrated me when I was a pretty new lifter, and something I think that frustrates a lot of new lifters in general, is there's a lot of people out there with a lot of different opinions that they're, putting out into the world. And so then the question is like, by what rubric can one adjudicate differing opinions? So if two people who are, big, strong, successful, if they're saying two completely different things, how can you know which one of them is more correct?
Yeah.
And so I certainly think that there are philosophical issues with science, in general. I assume your listeners probably don't want this to turn into a philosophy of science podcast, though. But I do think that there are some philosophical issues with science, and I think that in terms of like practically what sorts of experiments one can do, and practically how those experiments are done, and then what you can derive from them, I think there's some issues potentially there as well.
Yeah.
But I think that the objectivity and generalizability of what you get from science is probably a little bit better than what you can get from just like anecdote. I don't think that it's sufficient on its own. So in general, I mean, now I've been coaching for close to 10 years. Wait, how old am I? Yeah, close to 10 years. It's going to be 10 years this upcoming year. So at this point, I have like a fair amount of experience to lean on as well.
Yeah.
But I think, so when I was first starting out, and getting more into the science, what I would generally look for is if there was a successful coach that I trusted and research saying the same general type of stuff, I'm like, okay, this to me feels more validated than, something I'm just seeing in the research or just hearing coaches say. Like if, I don't think, like I'm not someone who believes something either 100% or 0%. It's more like, how much confidence do I have in a particular proposition? And so like if I'm just seeing something come up in the research, I might be, 70% confident in it.
Yeah.
If I'm seeing a fair number of successful coaches say one thing, few coaches saying the opposite, but a fair amount saying one particular thing, I might be 70% confident in that, which, might be enough to implement in practice, but a little more tentatively. But then if I see, people with practical experience and the research saying the same thing, I'm like, okay, now I can be quite confident that this is good and useful. And so when I was first starting out, it was more like, the research combined with the experience of other people. And now that I have more experience, it's more like the research combined with my own practical experience.
Yeah, I think that's a good.
But it's more like that. It helps provide a layer of objectivity that, that I personally couldn't have, and that, coaches arguing back and forth on the internet couldn't have.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of looking at it when you're saying there about how confident you are with what you're going to implement in terms of training or a program or whatever it may be. Because I think sometimes, especially because I think powerlifting now is becoming a lot more popular, and there's a lot more information out there of it. So everyone's going to straight away look at, oh well, so-and-so's been doing this for years, so I'm going to do that. But then there's a study that'll come out to back it up, or there'll be something completely new. I think, because of obviously a lot of powerlifting in the social media and research and all that sort of stuff, people can get a little bit confused and just jump down the track of, oh well, I want to give this a go because this is something brand new, whereas actually, it's not being linked together and actually applied in the real world. You mentioned there about looking at the research side of things, and looking at the couple of recent blogs that have been coming out on the Stronger by Science website. And you mentioned it before we started chatting on the podcast that there's going to be a little bit more content coming out on that. But injuries in powerlifting, obviously at the minute it was quite sort of a generic side of things. But just want to have a little bit of chat about the study that you actually did on the injuries covering powerlifting.
Yeah. So as far as injury research goes, there is some on powerlifters, but most of it is retrospective. So, for example, you might get a call from a researcher, like an email, and they'll ask, like, have you been injured in the past year? And then what has your training been like in the past year? And like, it's a lot easier to do a retrospective study, obviously, but there are some issues there. Namely, I don't remember everything that's happened to me in the past year. I'm sure no one else does either.
Yeah.
So, it's better than nothing, but the reliability, can't talk. Reliability isn't going to be incredible. I think that there maybe was one prior prospective study, but not many.
Yeah.
So my friend Andrew Patton got up with me, and I had a database of just information about a few thousand lifters that was retrospective, and one of the things I had was injury data. So we wrote a couple articles from that. Andrew is a PhD student in epidemiology, so he knows a lot more about stats, and specifically the type of stats one would use for this type of problem than I do. So, I was the one that came with like the background, knowing the research in this area. He was the one who knew the most about stats and the relationship. So we partnered up and wrote a couple articles based on the older, like, retrospective injury data that I had laying around. And then we linked up to do a prospective study, just, recruiting some lifters and then following their training for a year to see, how many of them got injured, and then also what were predictors of whether they would get injured or not. It hasn't been top priority for either of us.
Yeah.
So we're not totally done analyzing all of that data. But we do have like the basic stuff done.
Yeah.
So just to start with, our total sample was about 350 people. And one of the issues that you have with any sort of prospective study like this is you're going to have people drop out. And so we started with 350 people, give or take. And at the end of a year, 190 were lost to follow-up, meaning they just stopped responding to our emails, which is annoying. But then in terms of people who actually finished, 118 sustained an injury and 42 did not, which is pretty high. Like, they're, over the course of a year, close to 3/4 of the total sample ended up getting injured at some point in time. And in terms of general predictors, basically the strongest predictor of whether someone was going to get injured going into the year is, so we asked people about, just a lot of baseline information, but one of them is, are you currently dealing with any sort of physical limitations? And people who went into the study already dealing with some sort of physical limitation were quite a bit more likely to sustain an injury over the upcoming year than people who didn't come into it with any physical limitations, which isn't, that's not mind-blowing information. It's been known for a long time that one of the strongest predictors of future injury is previous injury. But that was, I guess, good to see in our sample. And then in terms of injury site, we found that shoulders, low back, really just shoulders and low back were the most common injuries overall. And then kind of comparing men and women there, just various lower body injuries were fairly common in both the males and females in our sample. But for the most part, like, women didn't really get non-shoulder upper body injuries. So like there were a few women who had shoulder injuries, but elbow injuries and like pec strains and stuff like that pretty much seemed to be exclusive to males in our sample, which I don't know that that's been reported in the research before, but that's certainly something that I've seen in the gym over the last 15 years. It's not too uncommon to come across female powerlifters with like a creaky shoulder. But you just don't hear about that many women getting pec strains or really annoying elbows. You tend to hear about that more from male lifters. And so that's what we saw in our sample as well. Moving forward, our next article on this is going to deal with kind of like per unit time injury rates. So how many injuries were sustained, on a per workout basis, on a per 1,000 of hours of training basis, on a per number of times you train a lift basis. So that's what we're currently working on. But like I said, right now, only just the very, very basic results are in.
Yeah, absolutely. I know. Obviously, you mentioned that it wasn't the priority for it, but from sort of as I was reading the articles that you've put out there, it just makes you think that, especially when you're speaking to quite a lot of powerlifters, sometimes a lot of them can mention about the little niggles that they've got, or they've been injured from doing another sport and then have come over to powerlifting. It's sort of one of those things that if you can sort of highlight what the key areas are, then you can sort of have an idea of, right, how do we sort of counteract that or reduce that. What was the reasoning behind? Obviously, you mentioned there was a couple of research studies that were sort of retrospective. What was the reason behind sort of actually wanting to carry out this? What was the plans for after the study, like the practical applications?
So in terms of why we did it, just curiosity. Since there wasn't much prospective research on injury rates in powerlifters, just wanted to see it, or just wanted to do it, see what the results turned out like and how they compared to previous findings. It's one of those things where if I have a question, I'm going to do my best to try to answer it. And sometimes that just means pulling up the old Google machine. And sometimes that means doing a year-long prospective study. So that's why. And then in terms of practical applications, I'll have a better idea of what those are once the analyses for our next article are done. Because based on the current one, it's just like, don't get hurt, bro. And if you are currently dealing with some sort of like ache, pain, physical limitation, be careful. But that's not particularly useful. There should be more useful and practical takeaways when we're done with the analyses for the next article.
Yeah. Do you think that there's going to be a little bit more research for actual injuries in powerlifting, further research following on from this? Do you think there's going to be other more sort of in-depth, because obviously you mentioned about being quite a lot of retrospective, and a lot of it has been around what programs are going to work best. But obviously this is something where because the most successful lifters are those who will be the most consistent and can lift longer. Do you think there's going to be a little bit more research on this going forward once it's all published and written up, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think there will be. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot more research on powerlifting and powerlifters in general. So as you were talking, I pulled up PubMed just to see how many studies per year are getting published about powerlifters and powerlifting. And so just using like a wild card search with like powerlift asterisks to fill it in as either powerlifters or powerlifting. Just looking at this, like there are 170 studies in total about powerlifting that are indexed in PubMed, and more than 50 of them have been published in the past 2 years. Okay. And close to half of them have been published since about 2016. So the first batch of studies in the database are from 1982. So there's been research on powerlifters, taking place between 1982 and the present year, and close to half of that total research has been published in the last like 3 or 4 years. Right. So the rate at which powerlifting research is being done is picking up. Yeah. The size of the sport as a whole is growing a lot, which, I mean, that may have been one of the reasons there wasn't that much research on it before. Like, one, it's a lot harder to recruit for studies when, there's 5,000 total people in the world competing in the sport, and 2 of them live in the town where your university is. Yeah. Kind of hard to do research on that. So yeah, the sport's growing. There's more and more research on it. So I think there will be more and more coming out in the future. But yeah, so I mean, right now there is a fair amount of research out there on powerlifters. There's just not that much like high quality injury stuff.
Yeah, because I know as well with it's like with anything, as soon as things start becoming a little bit more professional, if you like, and the bigger stage that powerlifting's getting on, it's like when you look at other sports such as, you mentioned there about American football, rugby over here, that there's going to be a lot more science on it so that you can back up what you're saying. But in terms of when you said there about the first study was in 1982, I think sometimes a lot of it is just experimental, and then them just trying things out, not actually, noting anything down. It's like on the if you watch the West Side versus the World film, Lewis was experimented, with the reverse hypers and that sort of stuff, and it was just him trying to figure out what's going to be the best way for him to be able to lift. But obviously now going forward, everything's a little bit more bigger sample sizes for research and that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah, for sure. Man, some of the earliest powerlifting research that was done, I think to this day is still some of the best stuff. Yeah. So there was a group headed by McLaughlin. And oh man, I should remember what school they were at, but I don't. I think maybe it was Auburn University, but one of the bigger schools in the South. And so the folks there was a research group. There were like 3 or 4 of them doing this research. And I think that they were all competitive powerlifters, and at least a couple of them were reasonably high-level lifters. And so a lot of the early research they did was like they were buddies with a lot of folks who were among the top lifters in the world at the time. And so, either they'd fly out to world championship meets and set up cameras to analyze like biomechanics of the people who at the time were the top lifters in the world, or they just like, call up their buddies who were, among the 20 or 30 best lifters in the world and just say, come on down to Auburn. We're going to do some research on you. And, we're not going to be able to tell for sure what is the optimal way to squat, bench, deadlift, but we can at least get a really good idea of how some of the best lifters in the world squat, bench, and deadlift, which probably is at least a decent technique. So yeah, a lot of that research in the 80s from McLaughlin and his group is still awesome and like holds up really well. And some of the samples that they were able to recruit, still some of the best samples for like just getting an idea of how elite lifters perform, and especially their biomechanics. Mostly for bench press. A lot of their work was focused on the bench press.
Right.
But yeah, like it's still like really good research. There's a lot of research from the 80s that really doesn't hold up. But the stuff from that group is still good. Like I'd recommend pretty much anyone check it out.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It is one of them. Once you start diving into it, you know, it's a little bit like I'll chat to clients and powerlifters that I'll work with, chatting about, oh, well, can I try this? Can I try that? And actually, some of that research that's been done, you know, in the 80s, look, this still works. It's proven that, you know, the foundations of it are still the same. So why try something new when, you know, 30 odd years ago it was successful then, and it's still being carried through and is still sort of successful now, which you know, I find really interesting. But then, like you say, there's some studies that you might come across that you just think, how did this even happen or come across?
Yeah, I mean, just both like standards of research and how good instrumentation is, like both of those things have improved a lot over time. So there is a lot of older research. So, okay, one of the things that bugs me a little bit is if you cite an older study, like let's say something from the 80s or 90s, you'll come across a lot of people who act as if research has an expiration date. Like, oh, this study is more than 5 years old or more than 10 years old. Isn't there something more recent showing the same phenomenon? Like, you know, it's old pretty much. And just assuming that because it's old, that means it's bad. But the thing is, like, for example, if it's like protein research, you would be justified to not put a lot of stock in older protein research. Yeah. Like especially stuff looking at, you know, what is going to help build the most muscle. So if it's like a longitudinal study and they were actually looking at changes in muscle size, that's cool. But if they're looking at acute markers, we have pretty good methods to assess muscle protein synthesis these days. Mostly based on like taking biopsies and looking to see how much of like a tracer amino acid is incorporated into muscle tissue after a workout or after a meal or whatever. Back in the day, what they used to use is nitrogen balance, which is basically, you know, having an idea how much nitrogen you ingest and then how much you pee out. And nitrogen balance is better than nothing, but it's not great. Yeah. So like, you know, if you look at older research on protein and they're just assessing nitrogen balance and you're like, it's nitrogen balance, you may not want to put too much stock in this. You'd be totally justified to do that. But for example, like biomechanics research, for the most part, like the way that a lot of that is done is exactly the same way it was done in the 70s or 80s. You just have high-speed cameras set up. You put reflective markers on joints to know where they are in space at any given point in time. These days, a lot of this is automated. Back in the day, it was mostly done by hand. Yeah. But basically, you just watch the video back through frame by frame and just like chart where joints are in space throughout the entire process. And then, you know, there's pretty straightforward kinetic and kinematic equations to know what forces are in play there. So yeah, like, you know, if someone wanted to say like, oh, this biomechanics study is invalid because it was done in the 80s, that's just laziness. Like, because it's literally the same research methods we use today, just a lot more labor intensive. So, yeah, I mean, good research doesn't have an expiration date. The same the same laws of the universe that are governing the world today or governing the world in the 80s. Like physical reality hasn't fundamentally changed. It's just kind of a question of whether research methods have changed over time. And if they have, like, the new stuff is maybe a little better. If research methods haven't changed that much over time, or like maybe if there's a slightly better method today, but the older one was still fine, then like old research is still good. Like it's still research.
Well, that's especially if it's the first type of research that's being conducted on it. You know, someone's got to be the first one to give it a go, and there's going to be times where, as it progresses through, there's still something that you can take from it, or build on what they've already done. Like you mentioned there about the nutrition side of things in terms of biomechanics. You know, technology develops as it goes, so it does make it a little bit easier. But I do think that there are things that you can take, even if you take things from it that you think, oh well, I wouldn't have done it that way. Maybe we can use what we've got to make it a little bit better, rather than just writing it off. Because it is sometimes of a case, you know, that you said that just because it's old, you just think, oh well, it happened in the 80s, but I'm not going to use that there. But actually, when you look at some of the lifters in the 80s and 90s, like, they were still strong. It wasn't as though at the time they were the strongest there. It wasn't as though, you know, the whole concept of powerlifting or nutrition or strength training or anything just didn't exist at the time. You know, they were strong. They were competing, which, you know, completely agree. You know, there are things that you can take from it. Just moving on from the injury side of things. The other thing, which is sort of not a bone of contention, but people always have an opinion on, is single arm and single leg training. You know, whether it's beneficial, because obviously from a powerlifting point of view, squat and deadlift and bench, you're using both arms, you're using both legs. What's your take on from a powerlifting point of view? We can chat about, you know, general population athletes if we want to go down that route, or actually implementing single arm and single leg training.
I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea to try. Just so my general take on like side to side strength imbalances are that unless it's pretty extreme, I don't really worry about it all that much. So, you know, like I see a lot of people who, you know, maybe have like a very, very slight hip shift in the squat, but they just obsess about that. And it's like, oh, you know, my lift isn't perfectly symmetrical. I think some people have a little bit of OCD about it. Like they kind of care more about how their lifts look than how much weight is actually on the bar and whether they're actually making progress or not. So yeah, like maybe their lifts are slightly asymmetrical and they put, you know, months and years of effort into trying to correct that and never actually end up making any meaningful progress. So yeah, I'm not, like, humans aren't symmetrical creatures. We're like, if you look at any of the research out there on just anything, very, very few people are perfectly symmetrical. There was a study by Flanagan a while back, looking at like joint forces in the squat for like 20-ish, I believe competitive weightlifters. I don't think it was just a sample of random people. I think they were competitive weightlifters. And, you know, looking to see ankle, knee, and hip moments in the squat in the sample. And I think they operationally defined like an asymmetric application of force as a greater than 10% difference side to side. And literally none of the lifters were within 10% of like the same amount of force applied on both sides of their body, right. Which, like, you know, I think that would be the norm rather than the exception.
Yeah.
Yeah, like people aren't perfectly symmetrical. And so I think when it comes to like single arm, single leg training, I think that more often than not, like it might be able to just like get in people's heads where it's like, oh, my right leg is 5% stronger than my left. That's something I know now, but is it good? Is it bad? Who's to say? And I think a lot of people's default is if something isn't balanced, it must be bad, and I need to put in a lot of work to correct this. So my personal take is that like if there is an extreme imbalance in either strength or mobility side to side, that could possibly lead to problems.
Yeah.
But it has to be pretty large before I care.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's a terrible idea to try out some single arm, single leg training. Make sure you don't have any really, really big side to side strength imbalances. Um, and if you do, then, work on it. But probably just pick like the handful of exercises where things are the most asymmetric. So, for example, for myself, I do a fair amount of single leg RDLs, um, more so from like a mobility perspective than from a strength perspective. But like if I was standing just on my left leg and tried to go down and touch my toes, left leg, super easy. Right leg, it's terrible. Like I don't know why that is, but if I don't consistently do single leg RDLs, uh, like dead ahead hip flexion and especially hip, is that internal? Yeah, hip internal rotation on my right side is just going to be shit. Like I don't know why. That's just kind of what my body gravitates towards if I don't do single leg RDLs. So I do some single leg RDLs just as kind of like a prophylactic thing. But that's, and I know I have more bilateral asymmetries than that. It's just like that's the only one that if I don't do something about it, it's big.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not a generally bad way to approach it. And I think that like for the most part, I think that bilateral training tends to even out asymmetries unless you kind of get to like a tipping point of asymmetry, if that makes sense. So, most people first day in the gym, whatever your dominant arm is probably going to be a decent bit stronger than your non-dominant arm. But what you tend to see over time is people start training, they start lifting, and within a year or so, the strength of their two arms is much closer to being balanced than it was their first day in the gym. And I think that that's how people tend to trend over time. I do think it can be different if you develop a huge strength asymmetry at some point, such that you do start like shifting a whole lot of the weight to one side or the other. So, I mentioned before someone who has like a little hip shift in the squat, don't really worry about that. I have seen some people in the squat and especially the conventional deadlift, where, as soon as the weight starts coming up, it looks like they're shifting 90% of their weight to one leg.
Yeah.
At that point, at that point, it's probably increasing asymmetry rather than moving back in the general direction of symmetry over time. So I think if there's like a technique thing going on that's that large, then like, yeah, you're probably going to get a fair amount out of single joint training or single arm, single leg training. I mean, I think it's probably going to help performance, very well may decrease injury risk, even though I don't want to say that super confidently because I haven't seen research on it, but
Yeah.
I think it would probably help decrease injury risk. But I think that like, I think the percentage of people who need to do single joint training is for more than like one or two exercises is pretty low. So like I said, I don't think it's a bad idea just to do some to check. Like, and if you do find like maybe one or two exercises where there's a big difference from side to side, then yeah, sure, do that thing. But I think it would probably be overkill to just like proactively program in split squats and single leg RDLs and single arm rows and single arm landmine press or what, and just programming in a half dozen different single arm, single leg exercises just because.
Yeah.
Like I think that's a decision you should come to after kind of assessing yourself. And I would think that the vast majority of people probably don't need to do more than one or possibly two single arm, single leg exercises.
And as well, if it was an entire workout of single leg and single arm exercises, that would be probably one of the longest workouts that you could do, just swapping arms and legs all the time.
Oh yeah,
I know,
for sure.
I know from that, you touched on it there. That if the gap is too big between both sides, then yes, that needs addressing. But sometimes I think you can be a little bit picky. An example is there was a woman in the gym, and her, when she stood, sort of one foot was slightly in front of the other. Nothing major, unless you'd really, really looked at it. It wasn't as though like it was dramatic and think, oh my god, she's basically stood in a split squat. But one of the coaches highlighted it, and then it was in her head. She's relatively strong, already. Being able to do quite a lot of weight on the squat. But you said it at the start. Sometimes it can just get in your head. And she was thinking, oh well, do I need to change my squat stance? Do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? Whereas actually, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are, but I mentioned there, does it cause you pain day to day? Does it actually hurt when you're doing the lift? And she was like, no. Then you don't have to worry. You don't have to worry about it too much. The thing I took from what you were mentioning there is, if you are adding the single leg exercises in, just trying to sort of reduce that imbalance rather than making it a little bit bigger. And like you mentioned there about the hip shift, if it's getting too big, then you need to address it. What's your take on the single arm and single leg exercises in terms of increasing muscle then? Because I know for myself, I've programmed, and I've had it myself, where I've had split squats or rear elevated split squats to help increase muscle mass. What sort of the findings behind that, or what have you found on it, from not from a strength perspective, but from a muscle building perspective?
I mean, I'm sure it can build muscle mass. I'm skeptical that it would build muscle mass better than bilateral training. Yeah. There is a theoretical argument to be made for lower body exercise specifically. So for like lower body exercise to failure, there's some research indicating that if you just go one side at a time, you might be able to like perform better and get a few more extra reps. And that like, I don't know that all of the mechanisms are known, but basically it seems that there's a decent chance that for bilateral lower body exercise, you kind of like fail and crap out before your muscles are actually fully fatigued, but you can actually get a little bit closer to like true failure if you train unilaterally. And that doesn't seem to be the case so much for upper body. I mean, maybe just because you're dealing with smaller muscle mass in general. So like the signals from your brain down to your muscles are smaller for upper body. Yeah. I don't know. So like, I don't know. Maybe there is a case to be made for like unilateral training for lower body hypertrophy work. I'm not really sold on it. Like untested bodybuilding, that's a completely different world. Yeah. But looking at like drug tested powerlifters and natural bodybuilders, generally you see just as good as, if not better, lower body development in the powerlifters and the bodybuilders. Like the lightweight and middleweight male drug tested powerlifters, like a lot of them, their legs just look comical because they're so big just from doing a shit ton of squats and deadlifts.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Maybe could you build your legs 3% more efficiently doing unilateral training versus bilateral? I mean, possibly, but I don't think overall the difference, well, I don't personally think the difference is there. But if it is, I don't think it would be particularly large. So, I mean, like, you certainly can build strength with, or like both strength and muscle mass with unilateral training. I just don't know that, it would be better, like I think it would be just as good.
Yeah. I'm quite glad you sort of said that, because that's sort of in line with what I was thinking, because the staples are, I'll always try and add a deadlift and squat into the program, and as the program develops, like you said at the start, chatting about the the single-sided side of things, you might just add them in. It's not going to be a case of you wouldn't build a program entirely around the single-sided single arm or single leg. Is there any sort of go-to single leg exercise? I know you mentioned there about a landmine and that sort of stuff. Is there a spectrum of single arm or single leg exercises that are potentially better than others, or are they all pretty much similar?
I mean, it just depends on the athlete's needs. For someone who has like a huge asymmetry in quad strength, single leg RDLs would be dumb and worthless. And, like single leg squats or split squats, obviously a better option. If there's a asymmetry in hip strength, then the single leg RDLs would be a better option. So yeah, it depends on the athletes and what their needs are.
Yeah. What have you found to be programming with athletes, if you are, or the athletes that you work with, if you do start implementing these into programs?
So I do prescribe a reasonable amount of both single leg RDLs. I find that is something where a lot of people have like fairly notable range of motion discrepancies. So, if I have a new client, one of the first things I'll tell them to do is just, without any load, just stand on left leg and try to go right hand to left foot. How does that feel? And then stand on your right leg and go left hand to right foot. How does that feel? In my experience, probably 60% of people or more find it way, way easier to, go and do that on one side versus the other. And so I find that for those people, single leg RDLs are helpful. So I end up prescribing those a decent amount of the time. And then I also find myself prescribing various types of lunges or split squats a fair amount. Not so much for the unilateral training benefit, but more so like there are some people who just like need more general lower body training than their back is really happy with. So, if you're trying to train both squat and deadlift hard, both of those things are going to affect your back. And so some people, we're not talking like injuries, but just like their spinal erectors get really fatigued and worn down if volume gets pretty high for both squat and deadlift. And so just for people who train in a gym that has like a leg press or hack squat, generally that's what I would go to. But if someone trains in, like a strength gym or like a CrossFit box or something like that, where they don't have access to a hack squat or leg press, then like split squats still let you train your legs without much or any spinal loading. Yeah. So I find myself prescribing a lot of split squats for that reason, not so much for the like unilateral benefit.
Do you think it's more common to find, because thinking about it there, managing the training volume side of things, and if squat and deadlift, like they do hammer you back quite a lot. Do you think that's more of a reason why people should be programming those, and rather than looking at the unilateral benefits of it?
I mean, I think so.
So for that, obviously we've covered quite a couple of topics on there, chatted about quite a lot in depth about the research side of things, and more research going to be hopefully coming out on that, as well as single arm and single leg exercises. From everything that we've chatted about there, is there any take home points or words of wisdom that you've got for everyone listening?
I mean, I feel like I've said about everything I wanted to say about the topics we've covered, so I don't know.
So for everyone listening who might want to find where you're at, so by Stronger by Science, or the content that you're putting out there, where can people find you?
Website, strongerbyscience.com. That is where the vast majority of my free content is. Also have a podcast now that you can find that at sbspod.com, or just wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. It's called the Stronger by Science podcast. If you're interested in checking out the research review I put out every month with Eric Helms, Eric Trexler, and Mike Sordos, that's called MASS, or Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. You can check that out at strongerbyscience.com/mass. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm probably most active on Instagram these days. So we have a business account that shares information that is at official Stronger by Science, I believe. And then my personal account occasionally share lifting videos, fair amount of recipes, and pictures of my dog. And that's just at Greg Nuckols.
Yeah. Awesome. 100% everyone listening, the mass that Greg puts out is really, really helpful. There's loads of great content in there, and especially the articles that he's put out on Strong by Science. Really, really well worth a read. I know as a lifter and a coach myself, they've massively helped me. And again, the mass that's sent out every month just keeps you up to date, and it's a little bit more easily digestible. So thanks a lot for taking the time to chat with me, Greg. Thanks a lot for everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.